Hi there, and welcome to episode 3 of the ADHD Adult UK podcast series. As always, I'm joined by spherical-faced dotard Alex Connor.
Aight.
I mean, is it ever going to get better than this at the start of a podcast? You've got to grab people early, and instantly people have stopped listening. But anyway, we'll move on. Obviously, we are the co-founders of ADHD Adult UK. Which is an online support group for all your adult ADHD needs. Our podcasts, as usual, are a tragedy in 3 parts. We normally choose a theme, and you can see, if you're watching, what the theme is. We will explain it to those that are listening in a little bit. Last week, we talked about drugs that are used for ADHD. Before that, we talked about diagnosis. This week, we're going to talk about rejection-sensitive dysphoria. So if you stop listening now, that would be really ironic.
Is it rejection sensitivity dysphoria, though? Like I said in the trailer?
Yes, you said and wrote in the notes as well. So I'm not that I want to give you rejection sensitive dysphoria, but you clearly don't know much about ADHD, do you?
I think the amazing bit, James, is that we have notes for this.
I know. Who would ever believe that there are notes and that actually we prepare in any way whatsoever? Anyway, back to those notes. The 3 parts of our podcasts are based around what we call evidence-based psychoeducation. So first of all, that is giving you information about the disorder so you can better understand why you do the things that you do, and that can help you emotionally accept your ADHD. We also then talk about personal reflections, our experiences, and this week we'll be sharing some hilarious and embarrassing personal stories of rejection-sensitive dysphoria. And then we'll finish off with some top tips that we've been given or that we find work for us. So, to kick us off, Alex, what the fuck is rejection-sensitive dysphoria?
RSD, James.
Yes, Alex.
Well, in a nutshell, RSD is it's emotional sunburn. If you slap somebody on the back who hasn't got sunburn, a little slap's not a big deal. Slap somebody on the back with sunburn and the same pain, or the same force, absolutely kills. And we think about RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria, as a form of emotional sunburn. ADHD people, almost to a human, feel the emotions of rejection far more intensely and unpleasantly and strongly than your average person. This is oversensitivity to rejection, or importantly, to perceived rejection.
So your formative years where every female that ever saw you rejected you must have been a really difficult time, I guess.
But it hasn't gone away, I'll be honest. Although it's now just one person I'm married to repeatedly.
And I listen, I have to add, obviously I know Alex very well, and I know his wife and children, and they're amazing, and clearly that just leads to the question who the father actually is.
I thought you were going to say, and we shouldn't joke about these things, but we do to pick it up. No, but no, just another toxic dig from James.
Yes.
So the important thing is about RSD is that it isn't actually one of the diagnostic criteria that doctors would say, oh, okay, you have ADHD. It's a huge driver. The criteria are around, obviously, impulsivity, inattention, and hyperactivity, which we talk about a lot. But almost everybody with adult ADHD reports fairly extreme rejection sensitivity dysphoria to a point where it may be included in the diagnostic criteria in the future. I just did this with my hand going forward.
I think that's interesting to point out that obviously as an adult with ADHD, our diagnostic process is entirely subjective. It's you saying to a psychiatrist, these are the things that I do, and them hopefully believing you when they get to that consultation. There's obviously, you can provide some evidence in terms of school reports that said Alex was dead thick when he was a child, etc.
Yeah, correct.
But it's interesting that something that is also completely subjective and yet universal in ADHD isn't yet part of those diagnostic procedures.
I hate to defend anyone at all because I hate everyone. You at the top of the pile,
especially me, yeah.
Especially you, yeah. But the reason why is actually scientifically valued. I mean, it isn't a bad reason actually, which is it isn't. Think about growing up with ADHD as you did, James, and I did. the behaviors that are manifest lead to a lot of negative thoughts, self-loathing, and reactions from people. Why are you like that? Calm down. Don't do that. Don't be like that. Be, and we grow up feeling like that. And it isn't actually psychologically clear if rejection sensitive dysphoria is biological phenomenon based on having ADHD as a neurodevelopmental disorder, or a sort of learned traumatic response to growing up with the behaviors associated with ADHD in a culture where, I'm boring myself, but in a culture where it's not really appropriate to behave the way we behave. So it seems that it's so rife that it's probably.
So I'm going to ask a stupid question, which, as anybody that's ever met me knows, is probably 70% of the questions I ask. Does that matter? Does that really matter? If it's something that almost everybody with ADHD has, and therefore it's something that can help you identify an adult with ADHD, does it matter if it's a biological manifestation of the way in which our brains are neurodivergent, or a kind of learned trait because of that, in your opinion?
It's a really good question. I mean, not really if it's everyone, it doesn't. Yeah. And actually, this data that it's, pretty much everyone is fairly recent. It's certainly coming out after the last diagnostic manual, the DSM-5 in 2010 or whenever it was. But at the same time, what we also have to do is make diagnosis regardless of culture. And so if your cultural background is one where you weren't put into a position, and actually I've got that a little bit. I was brought up in an environment where it was kind of appropriate to act out. I was brought up by hippies, essentially. Love your mum. And so I know, right? Where Adam Peaty comes from, James. We've talked about this.
We have. There's literally there's no. You left there before he was born, Alex. There's no link between you and Adam Peaty.
Explain my web toes, then, James.
I'm not even going to go there. Carry on, mate.
So yeah, what you don't want to do is misdiagnose people because they have been brought up in a culture where that didn't happen. But it looks like that's going to be changed anyway at some point. So that's in a nutshell the concept of rejection sensitive dysphoria, that you are too sensitive to rejection. And here's really, really important. I've said it already once, but I'll say it again. Perceived rejection, this idea that maybe you are walking the dog or walking around, and in your head you're thinking, if they criticize me for this, I would respond with this. I would defend myself. I will say, no, that's not me. And to a point where it's disabling. I have this myself, and I have to remind myself that they haven't said that. They're probably not even thinking it. And that isn't appropriate. That is an inappropriate emotional reaction.
Very true. Well, we'll go into a little bit more detail in section 2 about our personal experiences of when that happens. I just wanted to quickly ask a little bit about what kind of impact RSD can have on the life of an adult with ADHD. How do people generally tend to respond if they've got ADHD?
Well, that's it exactly, James. That's one reason, and another of the million reasons why ADHD is tricky to generalize is because of how we respond to the biology and the behaviors of ADHD depends on our choices, our personality, our upbringing, all sorts of things. And we joke, don't we, James, that people with RSD, some of them decide that they'll never allow themselves to be rejected by never being in the wrong, by being little Mr. Perfect or little Miss Perfect, and being, as we call them, a people pleaser. Other people have the exact same feeling. I'm not going to allow myself to be rejected by never engaging, by being, as you call me, James, a high-functioning psychopath. Someone
Sorry, can I just cut across you there, Alex? I call you a psychopath, not a high-functioning psychopath.
I only heard high-functioning. So it's not literally psychopath, everybody. We use these jokes. We know we're not supposed to. So do you disengage or do you people please? Either way, if it's a response to the fear of rejection because the pain it induces is so strong, then it's essentially a response to the exact same thing that comes across poles apart and very, very different. It can be devastating to people in their relationships, in their jobs, if they're perceiving their partner or their employer or their educator is going to reject them or say no to them, and that's not true, then they're preempting of that. It can be really damaging.
It can. So I think you've actually collected together there nicely a lot of the symptoms of RSD, as was written in the recent article on Focus Mag UK, which is an online magazine for adults with ADHD, where it lists the symptoms of RSD as being a chronic fear of rejection, obsessively thinking about negative experiences, especially those of perceived or actual rejection, misperceiving constructive criticism, which I think is interesting, and I definitely do that, or neutral feedback as rejection. Obviously, you never get neutral feedback; it's always just negative, isn't it? Perceiving rejection when it's not actually occurred, viewing minor rejections as being catastrophic, and that goes back to that catastrophizing, which I think we've talked about before. And then finally, that either perfectionism or people-pleasing tendencies. So if any of those things you recognize if you're listening to this podcast, there's a strong possibility, anyway, if you've got ADHD, that you do have RSD. But if those types of behaviors strike a chord with you, then it suggests that alongside your ADHD, you probably also have rejection-sensitive dysphoria.
It's worth mentioning, isn't it, that once again, yes, we know that ADHD traits are extremes of a mental continuum, and yes, everybody doesn't know who likes rejection. Everybody could argue that, but what is observed in the literature, in the evidence, in the science, but also anecdotally by all of us, is that when it's affecting you every day in many, many ways, to a point where it is disabling and destabilizing, then it might be real. Okay, so that was in a nutshell some of the evidence around rejection-sensitive dysphoria, RSD, being possibly a future criteria for diagnosis of adult ADHD. Moving on, James, this is the bit of our podcast where we talk about our personal reflections. RSD is big in both of our lives. Go on, yeah. You must have something to share here.
I've got loads. So for years, I thought it was imposter syndrome. For years, I just thought that I was a bit useless and that everyone thought I was rubbish and that I internalized all of this. You're nodding as if maybe that's possible.
I do think all of those things, but
that was a fucking subtle dig at me, Alex. I've got to admit that was brilliant. But no, for years, and it's still tied into self-loathing. But I didn't really understand RSD until I got a senior role at the university I work at, and a WhatsApp group was set up for this senior group of eminent professors and me. And just after my diagnosis, or just before my diagnosis rather, I was given the role of associate dean, which is, you wouldn't believe it because I'm not a functional human being. It's a semi-important role. Exactly. And that's abbreviated to AD. So I made a joke on the WhatsApp group, which wasn't funny, but I thought was fucking hilarious, which was when someone said, "Oh, I'm the AD something," I said, "Well, I'm the ADHD." And I laughed internally. And of course, because I just disclosed in that joke, in inverted commas, that I had ADHD, nobody responded. And then somebody about 20 minutes later mistyped something and said, "Whoops, sausage fingers." And everybody replied with crying, laughing emojis. And I was so hurt at the fact that people laughed at "whoops, sausage fingers" and not "I'm an ADHD," that my wife had to talk me out of quitting my job. I was going to leave the WhatsApp group, and that wasn't enough. It was, and you know what, I can't work with these people anymore. I've got to leave. I've got to do something else. That's how, and that is not a rational response. I was in so much mental pain from that, so much rejection, so much awful self-loathing that I wanted to quit the only job I could ever possibly do because I'm practically useless at everything else.
Sorry, sausage fingers.
Oh, thanks for that. Thanks for that. Yeah, sausage fingers. Clearly, on its own, sausage fingers is, empirically
objectively funny.
Objectively funny, sausage fingers, for God's sake. Yeah. So that's my main story of RSD. There are loads of little stories, but just in the interest of time and the interest of embarrassing you, I'd like you to tell our listeners a little bit about your experiences of rejection sensitivity.
I have them every day. I walk the dog every day, and I think if that person, sometimes not even a real person, criticised me for this thing that hasn't happened, I would defend myself. Absolute insanity. I just, it isn't actually going to happen. Perceived RSD is a huge part of my disability. I know, and even worse than that is real RSD. So I have such strong rejection sensitivity that I am borderline sociopathic. I've put myself in a position where I am not allowed. People cannot criticize me because I simply won't allow it. I qualified as a non-directive coach years and years ago because I wanted to learn how to do non-directive management. And the main reason was because the only way I can run my world, my own life, is non-directively. And so now I non-directively coach other people. It turns out that's the basis of ADHD coaching, which has been blooming helpful professionally.
Is that just because if you actually try and direct somebody to do something, they tell you to fuck off?
And they'd be correct.
Yes.
A bit. Yeah, exactly. Because I will only push open doors. I will give people an option and a choice, and their choice to do that thing is theirs. I don't emotionally engage. I kind of emotionally disengage from almost anything because it bloody hurts more than it should. It's stupid and I hate it. And so are you.
Thank you. Can I ask a question, which this fascinates me, because obviously anybody that's listened to these podcasts, all 30 odd of you, will so far have picked up the fact that we gently rib each other. And it's, to be fair, I take the piss out of you more than you do You know that's a joke. Well, actually, it's not a joke. You know, it's kind of semi-joke most of the time, isn't it? It's deeply embedded in the truism that is you. But equally, there's a lot of humour based around those jokes. But you don't get RSD when I call you a twat or a spherical-headed ludicrous buffoon. So how do you think you neurologically tell the difference between is it because you trust me and know me and you know that's a joke, or is it just because you've got a sense of humour and you can tell when someone's joking?
It's because we're a pattern spotting machine neurologically, James. At the front of the brain is the thing that spots patterns. I hate to use an old cliche, but you know, when we were cavemen coming out of the cave and you can see all the reeds in the grass. And if that pattern every day, that's the pattern. Oh yeah, it's just the grass. If that pattern was broken by, saber-toothed tiger or something, I don't know, I'm losing my mind. It would immediately break the pattern at the front of our brain. It triggers the fight or flight response, anger or fear or aggression, and we run off. Because of our trust and friendship over years and years, my pattern in communication with you is one that doesn't break a pattern of fight or flight. So it's a different part of the brain. So when we're having these conversations and if you rejected me about something that I thought it was real or meant, oh my God, it would be horrible. Because
we do have RSD with each other. So we have like 6 different WhatsApp channels where we deal with the various ADHD things that we do. And if I message Alex at 6 a.m. because I get it very early, he won't respond till after 9, and I start to think, have I pissed him off? And then it took Alex explaining to me what his morning process is, because he's got 16,000 children. And a dog, and dogs and cats, and has to deal with all of those things. And that's what made me realize that actually I probably haven't pissed him off. And in fact, I don't think I've ever really pissed you off.
Today, only a couple of times.
Only a couple of times, yeah. But no, I would get RSD thinking, oh God, have I upset him? That's not even you rejecting me. That's feeling the perceived rejection because I've hurt you, and then it would set me up full of anxiety for the day. So we do, even between each other occasionally. And you have said in the past when you've written something for one of our various
that's the trigger for me. That's the trigger when we write for ADHD. Sorry, when we write for Focus on ADHD. When we write for Focus on ADHD UK, the magazine, which you can get on the internet, by the way, James, you probably know the URL for that.
just go to focusmag.uk. Forget the name, because Alex is never going to be able to remember anything that's more than 3 words on the trot.
No,
focusmag.uk.
We are doing an episode on working memory, so watch this space if we remember. Yeah. So when I write for that, and I, for example, when I edit some of the stuff that you write, I have terrible RSD that you hate me for it. You think I'm arrogant. You think I've made terrible mistakes. And you always go, that's fine, on we go. Not even a thought. It's weird.
Or I don't care. You'll say, you'll put a comment in that says, well, what do you think about saying this? And I'll say, I don't care. Because normally it's right and it's fine, and it's okay. But you're right that we do, even between us, have that RSD. Just to one of the things you talked about, I think, because I've already forgotten, and we will do an episode on working memory in the future. You talked about those invisible conversations in your head that you have before an event.
Yeah,
that's something that from not my personal experience, but my wife, she does as well. So Sam, who's waiting for a diagnosis, will lie awake all night having conversations with her boss because she's absolutely sure he's going to sack her. So she'll go through every possible conversation from when he walks through the door through, why haven't you done this job and why haven't you done that? And of course, he walks in the morning and says, hiya, and goes into his office and walks past her. But she will spend the entire night awake going through every possible conversation that could happen. So she's got a response prepared for whatever he says. Is that RSD?
I think it is. I think it's it's perceived RSD, or it's RSD because of perceived rejection. I have the exact same thing, and a lot of us do. In fact, there's a lot of people struggling in relationships because the rejection they're expecting from their partner leads to preempting a negative behavior, when actually they weren't going to get that rejection anyway, and even if they did, that's okay. But so yeah, it can be incredibly damaging. What you've just described with your wife is something I face. Really, really, we're talking weekly. This isn't
With
like
my
a.
wife.
Yeah, it used to be strongly, but I'm getting on a bit.
Actually, as an anecdote, you and Sam have RSD about each other. Sam's my wife's name, and you both kind of think the other one doesn't like each other, and it's not true. It's just not true. You both really like each other, but you've both got this weird kind of I think RSD based approach to what the other one says and inferring things into that.
I think I've got this natural aura of like a protecting myself from people a little bit, and that is because of RSD, and I know it is.
So it's interesting that's a protective mechanism you can develop. We'll move on in the final section to talk about some top tips. And there's not a lot of evidence for things that can help, but we'll certainly do our best to give you some tools to try and help you if you've got RSD.
Right, welcome back to ADHDadultUK, episode 3 of our podcast, where we're talking about rejection sensitive dysphoria. I always get that wrong. We were just discussing some of our personal reflections, and actually, because we both have started to manage this a little bit, we thought we'd give you top tips that we've learned, hopefully evidence-based, on what to do about it. James, have you got anything? What do you do about RSD?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because my natural response, as we covered in section 2 of the podcast, is run away. Which is neither evidence-based nor practical. But actually this week something happened, and for the first time what I did, and I used to have this ability years ago, was to be able to genuinely compartmentalize and rationalize things that happen in my life. And it led to me being able to deal with incredibly intense personal issues, almost psychopathically, like I could step out of the situation and say, well, this is what needs to be done. That's the best course of action. And I've never attempted or approached RSD with that, but I did this week. So I was giving a guest lecture at a university, which was online. And at the break in between 2 lectures, the students that were attending didn't mute themselves. And as I went downstairs to make a cup of tea with my AirPods in, I heard them saying, oh, God, he goes too fast. It's bloody ridiculous. I haven't got time to make any notes. This is just too much. And that would have destroyed me a few months ago. I would just thought, oh, my God, that's like instant negative. I tend to think I'm a good teacher. I mean, some people like the teaching they do at university. But anyway, I had a quick think, and I thought, listen, they are having a learning experience and it's not working for them. So rather than just passive aggressively start the second lecture saying, well, I'll take a bit more time for this lecture, I said, listen, guys, full disclosure, you weren't muted. I heard what you said. But listen, how can we work this out? If I'm going a little bit too fast, please tell me to stop. And at the end of each slide, I'll say, are you okay for me to move on now? And it all worked fine. And I ended up with a little bit of anxiety, but not that kind of physical pain of, oh, God, people think I'm rubbish at my job. So if you can, and it's really difficult, try and step back and rationalize the situation. Is it serious? Is it dangerous? Is it likely to happen? And then try and compartmentalize it. Put it in a box and say, I can deal with that later. Alex, what about yourself? Any top tips?
That what you've said really is perfect advice. If you can, it's so hard to do. If it's perceived RSD, so I'm walking along and starting to get like in this sort of cycle of, oh, if they say that, I actually again step back and I say, there isn't anyone in this conversation but you. You're assuming people are going to say something. It isn't healthy. So what can you think about that's positive that's going to happen today? So that's something I try and do. If it works for you, then great. I know it doesn't work for everyone else. If it's real RSD, if I'm actually feeling it because I have been rejected or comments come, especially if it isn't that big, but it feels like the end of the world, Now, I will never miss an opportunity to become like a Los Angeles hippie, but I literally, James, say out loud to myself, I'm having an inappropriate emotional reaction. Like, out loud.
Please tell me you use that voice. Please tell me you use that voice when you say it.
I don't use that voice. No, I use my normal, charming voice. I'm having I'm having an inappropriate emotional reaction. But I say it, and actually recently with a couple of people I really trust, not you, don't hate you. A couple of people I say it to them, and it's been surprisingly disarming because people think that I'm trying to gaslight them by being angry because clearly they haven't said anything that bad, and I'm distraught. If it's inappropriate, then so be it. Shall we? What's your recommendation for a product to help with adult ADHD UK? Remember, we're not paid by anyone. What have you been using or thinking about this week?
If you want to pay us, we'd like some money, but obviously, no, that's a joke. We do this out of the kindness of our hearts, and because it's more interesting than our day jobs. So there's lots of different products and services out there that can help you with your ADHD. I'm going to talk very quickly about using an app which can regulate or manage your to-do list. So there are lots of these available. The one that I use is called Todoist. There's actually a list of resources on our website, including apps that can help you. The reason I use Todoist is it links to other apps I use, which things like Evernote that I record all my activities in. But Todoist sends me a daily email saying, here's the 6 things you need to do today. And that means for me, and one of my biggest problems is actually working out what I need to do. And then I get a lot of anxiety if I don't do the things I need to do. Having an email every morning that says, dear James, here's the 6 tasks you've got to do today, I find massively helpful in terms of coordinating my work life. So that's our tip for this week. There's an app called Todoist, but there are many more apps out there. But find a way of building a to-do list. And just as an add-on, one of the things we recommend when we coach is also try and have a done list. Now, if your app allows you to tick things off, then visually that's great. If you're using pen and paper, also write down the things that you've done, because often we worry about what we've not achieved and not what we have achieved.
Thank you, James. Right, that was episode 3 of our ADHD Adult UK podcast, where we focused on rejection, sensitive dysphoria, or RSD. If you want to get in touch, we are on all the socials, Instagram and Twitter and so on, at ADHDadultUK. If you want to recommend an episode, we'll discuss things. I think the next one might be Working Memory. Is that right, James? Episode 4, unless we get our special guest.
Fingers crossed, we do have a special guest lined. We have more than one special guest lined up, so fingers crossed we will have some special guests alongside the normal tittle, tatter and crap that we talk about.
Excellent. So please get in touch. If you want to read some of the magazine stuff, it's focusmag.uk. If you want to get in touch on the socials, it's ADHDadultUK. We love the comms, so please say hello. Right, see you next time, James. Thanks all. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.